Welcome to Project Immersed. Immersed is a series around music, health, wellness, and technology. Each episode, we bring together a diverse array of perspectives to explore how music and sound can improve our lives. Project Immersed is brought to you by Studio Feed. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of Project Immersed. My name is Cymone. I'll be your host for another episode of Sound and Psychedelics. I've said this before in previous episodes, but we're truly in a psychedelic renaissance, with more states and countries moving to legalize psychedelics and new scientific findings supporting the therapeutic implications of these substances. The movement continues to grow rapidly and exponentially. So I'm really excited today to be joined by two phenomenal guests who are sure to provide a very unique and valuable perspective to this discussion of sound and psychedelics. I'm joined by Michael Sutherland. Michael is a musician, producer, and recording engineer with a commercial music degree with honors from Massey University in New Zealand and a certificate from Maines, both of which focus on songwriting, composition techniques, recording, and music production. Michael is also a multi-instrumentalist, a songwriter, and a loop pedal artist who specializes in ambient sound journeys. Michael also spearheaded the creation of a revolutionary music project called Music and the Mystical Experience, which was released earlier this year. It was recorded for his postgraduate studies at Massey University with 28 musicians at Massey's flagship recording studio. This was based on years of research into the neuroscience of music, psychedelics, and of course, recording and engineering. This created a 6-hour work for psilocybin therapies, which aligns with the psilocybin experience and is filled with traits which support mystical type experiences and increases positive therapeutic outcomes in therapy. It was released a few months ago and it's already being used in centers across the world. So hello, Michael, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I am also joined by Zeus Tipado. Zeus is a neuropsychopharmacology PhD candidate at Maastricht University, focusing on researching the brain while under DMT inside virtual and extended reality. He's using FNIRS, which is functional near-infrared spectroscopy. I think I said that right. I don't think I said it right. We'll come back to that. But to give humanity its first glimpse on brain energy distribution and perceptual alterations in the visual cortex during this unique psychedelic process. Unlike the current trend of psychedelic research that investigates how psychedelics can be used to help maladaptive behaviors like depression and anxiety, Zeus is focusing on the perceptual experience of a psychedelic trip and analyzing human brain activity while in these altered states of subjective consciousness. Zeus is incorporating extended reality technology from SUBPAC and HTC to modulate perceptual information received within a psychedelic trip and explore the corresponding brain activity through cerebral blood oxygenation levels. Big word, sorry, one more thing. He is also the host of Snoop Dogg's Super High Score show and the creator of Stoned Gamer. His work has appeared in Double Blind Magazine, High Times Magazine, Psychedelics Today, Healing Maps, and Psychedelic Support. So hello, Zeus, and welcome. Thank you for being here.
That intro was fantastic. Oh my gosh.
Yay.
Give it up for Tyler. Wow.
I appreciate it. It's well due. Both of you guys have just amazing stories, amazing backgrounds, amazing perspectives to bring to this conversation. So I'm grateful to be in your presence and to be able to facilitate this dialogue with you both. So I know I've said a lot about you, but I would like to also hear from you. I'm sure there's more that we would want the audience to know so they can get to know you a little bit before we dive into this journey. So I'm going to pass the mic, maybe start with you, Zeus. Just give us a little bit more about you, maybe a little bit about your personal story and what led you into this space.
Yeah, no, thank you for that opportunity. And this is, definitely a fantastic thing. I'm super happy for this. So yeah, the space I believe you're talking about is psychedelics and perception. And that's a pretty fun space. And so how did I even get into this? So I've always been a science person, but always came at a pretty interesting fault. So when I was a kid, I grew up in a pretty interesting household. I grew up, most people, they grew up in like a, sort of Christian background. I didn't have that. I had a voodoo background. So I believe that, there was like reality, and then there was this other reality that had influence on this reality through things like curses and sort of, possessions, incantations. And that's how I understood like reality, just that there was this other reality that sort of puppeted this reality. And then when I was 8, my parents moved to Texas. And then I was exposed to not voodoo, not Creole voodoo, but like Christianity, Jesus, all this stuff. And I was just blown away that people believed that there was this person that had control over reality and life and the world. So I was pretty confused. And that's when I turned to science when I was about 10, because I just wanted to have a sort of objective understanding of reality, and I figured that if I could test it, then it can be factually validated. And that's how I was. I grew up with this sort of really, pretty fundamental understanding, science-based. High school, science classes, I got like awards and all this stuff. College, University of Arizona, I was doing fantastic. I was doing like a bachelor in psychology. Everything was fantastic. And then one day or one evening at a party, my friend gave me 5 grams of shrooms. And this is before I even understood what these things like were. He just said that I should take them. And I figured that, I was in college, I should probably experiment. So I did. And yeah, that first trip changed me big time. Big time. It definitely changed the entire path of my entire life, that significant experience. And I experienced this great shift in perception and augmentation in reality. And it was just overwhelming. I saw people change into these like colorful, like orbs or shapes or globs. Conversations were sort of pointless. People were playing beer pong in the kitchen. Beer pong was like absurd. So I went outside just to sort of collect myself. And I looked up in the sky and I saw this huge figure, this huge sort of entity, this creature or whatever. And yeah, that changed my entire path of life. And about a week after that, I added a second bachelor's to my sort of academic workload. I added religion because I figured that a combination of psychology and religion would help me better understand this sort of very interesting psychedelic experience. So that was the beginning. And of course, graduated with both those bachelor's and master's, and now I'm doing my PhD in a very objective way of sort of it's an objective approach to a very subjective experience. And that's where I'm at. That's where I reside. That's my background story, my origin story into this entire field.
I love that so much. I'm like smiling so hard and hearing your story about your first experience, because I feel like anyone who's had an experience, you get it, like how it just totally shifts everything and nothing is ever the same. So I love that. Thank you for giving us your story. Michael, I would love to pass the mic to you and hear a little bit about your story and your journey that's led you into this space as well.
Thank you. It feels kind of resonant with Zeus's story, actually. Like, I grew up going to schools and colleges that were quite heavily Christian. And I think must have been, that age around 13, 14, that you kind of rebel against that in some sense, and you head towards, for me at least, it was the kind of edge lords of materialism, the Christopher Hitchens, the Richard Dawkins, like just straight the other polarity. And then I was pretty late to get into what we would call the classic serotonergic psychedelics. I experimented with marijuana a little bit, but I think I'm too sensitive a person for that. It kind of just blows me open. And yeah, that really facilitated a reorienting and a rebalancing of those perspectives of, rationalism and intuition, of chaos and order, like just a rebalancing of those things. And I remember distinctly the first time I had a psychedelic, and I had been working with music for a long time at this point. And I heard something behind me outside. It must have been a bird or something. But it was the most behind me I'd ever heard anything. So it was like you've listened in mono your entire life, and then boom, 5.1. And this was a major perceptual shift that I noticed auditorily. And there are neurological reasons for this, obviously, like psychedelics and music share a lot of pathways in the serotonin 2A network, tonal tracking and spectral like listening of music is like fundamentally upgraded, and like you're far more sensitive to these kind of things. But yeah, that was a big shift for me. And for the end of my bachelor's degree at Massey, I was doing music for float tanks. So I worked at a float tank center, and I made music for this like altered state of consciousness of sorts. And then I guess for my postgraduate year, after experiences like these, I was like, I need to move on into this next field, which was making music for psychedelic therapy. And that's how that journey started.
I love that. Amazing. It's great to hear both of your backgrounds and just, what contributed to it's. Everybody's story is different, but it's like once you're in the space, I feel like the importance is felt, and it becomes a very near and dear space to people's hearts. So I'm grateful to hear the stories that brought you here, both of you guys. Okay, to kick off the conversation, I want to start by posing a question. So I'm not sure if both of you know, I think you do, but we've had a few of these episodes, Sound and Psychedelics. We've talked to scientists and musicians and ceremony facilitators and all kinds of people in the space, and really just pose the question to them of what is the role and the importance of music in these psychedelic experiences. As you know, Project Immersed, our mission here is to really bring to light the many ways that music and sound can transform our lives. And these particular episodes are just highlighting that with the power of psychedelics. So like I said, in past episodes, we've talked to scientists, and they've shared how music can play the role of being like timestamps throughout a psychedelic experience. We've talked to people from more of a ceremonial lens, and they talk about the use of sacred songs or the Icaros to guide people through the experience. So I'm just curious, from each of your unique perspective, to you, what is the role and the importance of music and sound in a psychedelic experience? Zeus, I'll jump to you.
Yeah, no. It's interesting. I don't play any sort of instruments. I played the bass when I was 16, but I don't really have a sort of proficient background when it comes to creation of auditory sounds. I'm not a DJ or anything, but I am a scientist, so I can definitely tell you. So yeah, what you said earlier, Michael, how there's definitely shared pathways, mostly subcortical areas in the brain whenever a person listens to pleasing beats or tones or tunes or whatever you want to call it, that there's a definite connection in the idea of pleasure pathways in subcortical areas. I think there's a ventral striatal activity as well. But yeah, there's a huge, but you don't really need honestly, you don't even have to have a sort of understanding of science to just like understand that listening to some good song or like a good album definitely increases the experience of an actual trip. You know, we can just validate that, but people really understand that, you know. And this isn't something that's a revelation. It's been happening probably since the 50s, 60s, even before actually with Icaros is what you said, which is a very sort of indigenous chanting, mostly in ayahuasca ceremonies. But yeah, there's some really good science showing that there is a really good relationship with good auditory signals and tripping.
Mm-hmm. No, and I like what you said too, because there's the science of it, which is fascinating to learn about, but then it's also just like felt, you know, I feel like anyone, you know, can feel the synergy of music influencing a psychedelic experience. So I love what you said and how you put that. Michael, I want to ask you the same question. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I think there's so many layers to this question that music is useful in a psychedelic therapy context, but I think it's also useful in a exploratory context in some of the work you're doing, Zeus, and how it influences the visual content as well. But I think, yeah, a good place to start is with the fact that you're right. It's been used by indigenous people the world over for, I mean, time immemorial. You can't really put a timestamp on that. And it's evident in the Amazon with the Icaros. It's, you know, the Bwiti tribe using ibogaine have musical traditions. The Mazatec Indians using psilocybin with Maria Sabina. They have certain songs, and peyote with the Native Americans. And then, so like when we delve into music for psychedelic therapy, it's like we are rediscovering, you know, these technologies. It's not this novel form of music therapy or music creation. In fact, it may be the primary, like one of the first modes of music making and the first use cases for music, if you can call it that. But it certainly activates key brain areas in terms of the psychedelic therapy approach. They did a study with LSD where they showed that there was activation between, I think it was the parahippocampal cortex and the visual cortex. And this was causing autobiographical memories from the past to emerge. And this only happens with the combination of music and psychedelics. And you can see that's very therapeutically useful. And the combination of music and LSD in this case also activated areas of the brain to do with self-referential processing. So how you see yourself in relation to the world and others, which is obviously very therapeutically useful. And at the level of just emotional modulation, you know, a therapist having multiple tracks. When I released music and the mystical experience, it came with playlisting data for guides, so they could see the relative intensity of the track, instrumentation, BPM, and whether they contained lyrics, what language they were in. So in real time, you can modulate someone's experience. You can stretch them a bit further, take them a bit deeper, or you can calm them down. And music is incredibly good at this. And really, especially if you're wearing eye shades and headphones, like music is about all there is, especially if you're taking a high dose, you know, because the subject-object distinguishment is like completely dissipated. And of course, there are certain traits of music which are supportive of psychedelic therapy, and these have been collated by John Hopkins. by taking all the music used in psychedelic centers across the world and distilling basically ingredients which are supportive of psychedelic therapy, and then going one step further to distinguish which ones are useful for peak experiences and which ones are useful for the onset and offset. So you get an even more distilled and refined kind of idea of what is supportive for these states. And then my research recently has been around how the brain entrains to musical stimuli, especially under psychedelics. And so if you were in an MRI machine, and I played you an A440, you should be able to tell exactly what note is being played to that person just by looking at their auditory cortex, because they fire synchronously. And they do so accurately that they've done experiments with owls, for example, where they play them music, in this case, completely stripped of the fundamental notes, just with the harmonics. And they put a transducer on the auditory cortex, and out of a guitar amp will come the original melody. So the brain is not just, perceiving the musical stimuli, it is synchronously firing, and even has the ability to reproduce a fundamental tone if that's stripped away and the harmonics are left there, because it's that intelligent. And then, of course, you have synchronous activity in the areas of the brain to do with movement, such as the supplementary motor area and the bilateral putamen. These are all synchronizing to BPM, meter, and rhythm. And these areas of the brain have to do with movement and motor planning. And it makes perfect, intrinsic sense that's why when you hear a beat, you want to dance to it. There's parts of your brain that are to do with these motor functions. The EEG patterns are synchronizing. So these are some of the things that interest me as well. And also, you have to think that if the auditory cortex is synchronously firing to melody and harmony and these kind of things in your harmonic content, and the brain is in a hyper improvisational state where it's having, maybe functional connectivity to different areas of the brain, such as the visual cortex, is it sharing this information, and is the musical content affecting the geometry that one perceives in these states? I think the anecdotal evidence for that is very high. And indigenous evidence for that is quite prevalent also. Certain songs or certain music is used to change the visual landscape, rid the visual field of certain things that are chaotic or not pleasing, and bring the visual or psychedelic experience toward more order and away from the less noise-oriented kind of experiences, which are overwhelming. So yeah, these are just some of the ways that I think music can have such a profound therapeutic effect, and also bring up so many questions about what the hell is going on? What is a psychedelic trip? And why does music have these effects, which is something we might get into later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, totally. Thank you for that, because there's so much in what you said. I really liked how you started to share some of the research that you've been doing and just diving into the neuroscience. I feel like both of you guys can bring forth so much information just about what's happening in the brain during these experiences and why certain things are happening the way that they are. Zeus, I want to be able to pass you the mic, because I know you you have a lot of information just on a lot of your research is focused on the human brain activity while in these altered states. And so I'm just curious if there's any, you want to piggyback off of anything that Michael shared, or if you just want to share some of the research that you're conducting in your specific area of focus. I know that you shared that you're focusing mainly on the perceptual experience of a psychedelic trip, which I think is really interesting, and focusing on human brain activity specifically. So I'm just curious to learn more about the research that you're conducting over there.
Yeah, no. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, so actually, yeah, there was a study, I think you referred to it. It came out in 2016 by Imperial College London. I think it was Kalen was on there, Ricard Harris. But yeah, they found that when a person has when a person is experiencing LSD, I think that was the substance that they used. And whenever you close your eyes and listen to something, that the sounds enhance the visual content that you actually get, which is pretty fantastic. And they found that out with fMRI research, which is a very interesting way to look at voxels in the brain. You can go really deep in the brain and see subcortical areas like the thalamus, cingulate cortex. And there are two things that I also wanted to talk about that Michael fantastically brought up. The first thing is, yeah, it's so wild because if you just search for psychedelic therapy, you always see a person with their eyes closed or blindfolded, and they always have headphones on. And you could just do it right now, just search for it, you'll definitely see it. But that type of therapy is the sort of predominant therapy that people are implementing. And it's interesting because what's happening is that you're closing off an entire sensory domain, vision, and you're trying to control the psychedelic experience with completely auditory sensations, like sound, a person talking to you, or a person talking, or listening to a really good song or something, or a good playlist. But I'm really not certain if that is the best way to conduct psychedelic therapy through completely auditory information. I think that it's important, since psychedelics do have a very important visual component, that perhaps we should probably try to control this very interesting experience with vision as well, with visual information. Like, how amazing would it be that in therapy, a person doesn't, cover their eyes, but they cover their ears, and they actually see things. And what they see externally gives them an actual auditory trip, or sort of auditory sensation that isn't experienced. I think that would be a really cool way to conduct therapy. But that's perhaps something that we have in the future that's lined up, which is fantastic if that's true. And also, one other thing. So yeah, the auditory cortex is very interesting, but all cortical regions, all sensory cortical regions, and that's basically any area of the brain that has that classic wrinkly look to it, that classic wrinkly brain look that you see in Halloween ads. That's the cortical areas, and that's the sensory areas where we experience all sensation, the end result of all sensation, auditory, visual, everything. And the auditory cortex is also in there, secondary and primary. It's right around here. But the thing is, the fun thing about the auditory cortex is, yeah, if you hear sound, if you hear certain tones and it comes up in the brain, you could see it through blood, oxygen, oxygenated blood, dependent, it's called BOLD, or you could do EEG. But that's just basic stuff, listen to something, you can see it in brain activity. That's basic stuff. But the thing is also, is that if you just think of hearing something, if you think of a song, if you just sort of have your eyes closed or have your eyes open or whatever, and just think of hearing an actual song, your favorite song, Beyonce or Drake, or I'm not sure what you like, Butthole Surfers, if you're into that type of old school music. But if you just think of this song or any song, it will show up in the actual cortex as if you're actually listening to the song, which is very interesting. So it tells us that definitely when we listen to something, it shows up in our brain. There's definitely a feedback process, or a sort of footprint. But if we just think of hearing a song, then it still shows up in the same areas, which basically says that the brain does a poor job at discerning between what's actually being heard and when you're sort of thinking of a hearing, or what you're hallucinating as well. And that happens in the auditory cortex and the visual cortex. You can just think, you can just like see a blue bus, and then you can think of seeing a blue bus, and it shows up in the actual visual cortex as if you are seeing a blue bus. Same thing with a auditory cortex. So yeah, it's I guess it's easy to trick our brain into perceiving sensory perception without actual sensory perception, which is a very interesting quality or a fault of the human brain. Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. I'm over here, my mind is buzzing. There's so much, but I also, in you saying that, I know, Michael, I know you're also passionate about how music affects the visual experience of these psychedelic experiences. So I want to be able to give you the mic as well, and then I'll chime in with some thoughts.
Yeah, Zeus, your conversation there reminded me of an experience of being in a float tank. And when I worked at a float tank center and was developing music there, I floated hundreds of times, but there was only twice that I went in for a float and it was silent. I didn't have music, and my brain just generated music. And it wasn't like I could tune in or out of it. It was like I had headphones on. It was just this generating music. And I remember one time it was quite abstract, and the other time it was like almost R&B. And I was like, where is this coming from? You know, what is happening here? And it also kind of reminds me a bit of, you know, the neuroscience of improvisation and musical improvisation, and how, you know, musical improvisation, especially in groups, is a really, really complex task. You're creating like in time, in key, aesthetically appropriate music in a musical environment in real time, you know? So you'd think an area like, say, the prefrontal cortex would be lit up, but it's actually heavily downregulated with just like a small functional connectivity to, you know, like the motor areas. And it kind of speaks volumes that, like, if you get out of your own way, which any improviser will tell you, it's like the stuff just flows through you, and you're almost more listening than participating in this. And so I think it's so interesting you talking about how, if you picture a blue bus, as soon as you said that, my brain was just like, blue bus, boom, like right there, parked right in front of my visual field. And how we're very open to suggestion, and the brain and the visual and the auditory cortex seems to, you know, replicate that just so well, and can't distinguish between you know, incoming stimuli and a suggestion, like you said. But then I think there's this other thing where there's this generative kind of principle. There's like this generative thing that artists in particular are very sensitive to. And there are ways, especially in a recording studio environment, that you can amplify this. And one of the ways to do that is with ritual, you know, with communitas, with you know, having like a sharing circle in prayer, and like maybe a ritual ceremony before recording, to kind of help simplify social roles and elevate the irrational and symbolic, you know. And indigenous cultures have been doing this forever, and we're so susceptible to ritual. I mean, you could think of like say like a microdosing study where they might have like psilocybin, LSD, and a placebo, but the placebo seems to be just as advantageous to people because of the ritual, perhaps the ritual of just taking that, and the thought process of tuning into your body or tuning into your intentions for the day. There's my braingasm from what you said, Zeus. That was really interesting.
No, thank you. And also I want to talk about what you said, because what you said was super interesting. I think you're bringing up there was an Imperial College London study that happened by Balaschietti, where he looked at sort of a subperceptual dose of LSD, psilocybin, or placebo. And he discovered that microdosing is as effective as placebo, which is very interesting. It tells you that, first off, that placebo, the act of believing in something to actually, happen or occur, creates an actual response, like you're taking something. So, yeah, that's a very interesting study by Balazs Skidig, and I'm going to give him some props. He's a really cool guy. And I also want to say something as well. You brought up the idea of artists creating sounds under psychedelics or under sort of a altered state of consciousness. And yeah, that's definitely the thing. You can go back in history and see, what artists possibly conceive, what albums on whatever. But a couple of years ago, we did research on this exact idea. And we found that this is by Kim Coopers and Natasha Mason, two fantastic scientists in our lab. And we found that psychedelics does this thing called, it increases divergent thinking and it decreases convergent thinking. So what is this? So a convergent, so let's say I give you a paper clip, and a very convergent way to think about this is this paper clip clips papers. That's what it's like built for. That's what it's like designed for. That's a very convergent way of thinking about a paper clip. But a very divergent way is taking this paper clip and saying, oh, well, I can make this into a flower pot, or I can make this into like a little stand for my phone, or I can make this into a little slingshot or whatever. That's a very divergent way of thinking about something. You come up with alternate purposes for a single thing that isn't designed for that purpose. So we found that when people are under psychedelics, that it increases divergent thinking, which basically means that we look at sort of, and this goes beyond just like conceptual things. This is also things like how to arrange songs, or how to arrange visual art, or how to arrange objects, or even how to talk. It increases our ability to take, I don't want to say mundane things, but I am going to say mundane things and give them different purposes. So perhaps this increase in divergent thinking, and if you apply that to something like creativity, which is like sort of the quintessential way to think divergently, you want to be creative, you want to think of different purposes for things. So if you can draw a conclusion from psychedelics increases divergent thinking, and divergent thinking is also a fundamental aspect of creativity, then you can say that psychedelics does enhance creativity. And that would also apply to things like creation of art, creation of code, creation of, poetry or whatever. But I do want to say this. Divergent thinking isn't always positive, in the sense that you don't take LSD and paint the next whatever, or make the next, I don't know, album of all-time album or whatever. It can also be like really weird and like sloppy. There's a fantastic study that came out a few years ago called I think it's the entropic tongue, where they found that psychedelics increases a person's ability to formulate words in a very abstract way. And yeah, on paper, it could look like it's very poetic, but a bunch of times it was just like ridiculous. It was like absurd. It was just, expressions of different adjectives and verbs, and that really didn't make any sense. So it increases divergent thinking, but divergent thinking isn't always positive creativity. But creativity isn't always positive creativity. Creativity could be, you could paint something or make a song you think is fantastic or amazing, and then you can wake up the very next day and say this is crap or this is garbage, or just like toss it out. But the fact is that it's helping us think, if you want to say this very overused term, outside the box. And yeah, that's definitely confirmed with the research that we've been doing out here in Maastricht University by Kim Coopers and Natasha Mason.
No, that's huge. That's huge. Thank you both for that. I'm over here thinking a lot. I'm going to share a bit of a personal story. So bringing it back to artists creating on psychedelics. So for those who don't know, I'm a singer-songwriter. I'm an artist. I make all of my music now from psychedelic ceremony and ritual. Michael, I'm glad you brought that in. Ritual is a really big part of my life. I'll usually, if I want to create something, I'll set an intention. And usually the intention is specific but broad, that like I want to channel divine messages through music and allow whatever to flow through. And what's been really interesting for me in that process, as a singer, when I first started singing, I could not hear harmonies. Like I was tone deaf to them, literally didn't hear them in the music I was listening to, couldn't sing them, couldn't hear them. It wasn't until I started smoking marijuana that I could hear harmonies. And I was like, wow, like there's a whole layer of music that I haven't even been hearing. I know it sounds crazy. But then fast forward to now psychedelics, I not only can hear harmonies, but I'm creating them like crazy. Like I can't stop. Like all of my music is very layered with all these crazy harmonies that I didn't even think I had the capacity to create. So it's interesting to hear you talk about how psychedelics promote divergent thinking, because I feel like I'm curious to know what was happening in my brain to where I couldn't hear harmonies. And now it's like, I've moved past that to where it's now I'm able to create them. I'm curious, I wanted to bring in intention, because I know you said, Zeus, that divergent thinking isn't always positive. And I'm just curious for any artists and creators out there who do want to experiment with, or who are already experimenting with creating music with the help of psychedelics. Do you think that intention can help to drive the divergent thinking to be more positive, or is it just kind of like you get what you get kind of thing?
I will say that's like abilities, the actual ability to create art, fundamental creation of art, and abilities, and that would probably be the single thing. And the reason why I'm saying that is because you can't take LSD. Like LSD can only amplify what is inside of you, or augment what is already inside of you. You can't take LSD and without any understanding of how to play the bass guitar, play like an amazing riff, like on comparable with like Bootsy Collins or like Flea or something. You can't take DMT and all of a sudden understand 16th century poetry in every single verse of every. So the idea that taking psychedelics can help you be a better artist, I think, is a bit overused. It can only augment your own abilities. It can't grant you abilities. It can't do that. Or if that's the case, then people would stop taking piano classes and start taking like DMT every single Tuesday,
Right.
So I would say that as far as the divergent thinking, how to sort of better angle that towards creation of art. Well, yeah, it's like definitely ability based, but can intention help you build something? Absolutely. Any sort of expectancy effect. Let's say, for example, you take psilocybin and you're expecting to have a bad trip, a bad experience because your friend told you that you're going to see this scary person or scary thing, or don't go into the dark and all this stuff. If you set your entire set, which is the thing that you call your predisposition, if you set your set to a very set that isn't sort of adaptive towards positive experiences, then yeah, you're going to have a bad trip. But if you set an expectancy effect of, listen, I'm going to take LSD and I'm going to think about this very complex problem, and I'm going to sit on it and I'm going to relax and I'm going to think about it, then guaranteed by the end of this, LSD experience, you will have a different perspective of whatever it is you're trying to build, you're trying to create, or trying to analyze. Absolutely. Will it be a better perspective? It will be a different perspective, for sure. It will be a completely different perspective. Will it be better? I mean, only you can assess your own ability and your own artistic creation. I can't. I can't assess a person's art, but definitely you can. So if you feel that what you're building is better and like truly feel that, then yeah, it can definitely, setting an intention can definitely help you achieve your goal when it comes to taking a psychedelic and building art.
Nice. I love that. Yeah, intention is so important. I feel like in any, regardless of the type of psychedelics that I've used anytime, and even just without psychedelics, it's what you said, it's the expectancy effect, just setting an intention for anything. Like before this Zoom, I was like, I set an intention, this is going to be a great conversation, and it's a great conversation. Like that's just, intention is a great tool in that way. I want to pass this conversation on to you, Michael, and give you an opportunity to talk about what you've created, Music and the Mystical Experience, a huge project, a great offering to the world and anyone who gets to experience it. So I want to give you the floor to tell us a little bit about it. I don't know if you want to pick up off of the intention conversation and maybe share some of the intentions and the ritualistic modalities that you use to get this project going.
Cool. Yeah, I think the intention conversation is really important in the context of music and the mystical experience and psychedelic music making in general, and the ritualization of those processes to bolster creativity and orient it towards, something positive. And yeah, I think the previous conversation, it's really about like psychedelics, whether it's LSD, psilocybin, or DMT, they're potential catalysts for creativity. They're not causing the phenomenon of creativity. They might give temporary access to more divergent thinking, which is, I think, more useful in some fields than others, maybe less useful for an accountant, but more useful for someone playing jazz, and yeah, and also like the flood of imagery one can have on a high dose of psilocybin, or especially DMT, is, DMT or LSD isn't creative. It's not going to sit there on its own and just write you an album. It's on a piece of paper, or it's a crystal. It's, it's catalyzing creativity. And I think it was Terence McKenna that said that, he was referring to psilocybin or DMT, but he said you see more visual art in an hour that's been produced by the human species in the last 100 years, which is a bit of a hyperbole, I must say, but it speaks to that absolute onslaught of visual and auditory hallucination that can happen, although hallucination is a loaded word, I must say as well, especially in the case of dimethyltryptamine, where imagery or geometry jumps from the three-dimensional. It has this kind of point of criticality where it pops out. There's these Escher shapes or hyperbolic geometry which can't fit in the 3D plane and then pops into 4D. People experience 4 and above dimension geometry, and I think music is especially equipped to deal with that and facilitate that, because music in of itself is a 4-dimensional object. Its true shape can only be seen through the passage of time, and any individual moment in music is contextual to what happened before and after. Yeah. And in Music and the Mystical Experience, what we did is we took all those traits that were listed from Johns Hopkins that and I analyzed the playlist as well as a music engineer, looking for things that were to do with production, to do with engineering, looking into how did they engineer this Miles Davis record? How did they engineer this Pink Floyd record or this Indigenous piece of music? And then taking those prompts from Johns Hopkins, we made a kind of like a deck of tarot cards. And so, Zeus, if you were playing the bass and you came up to me in the control room, you'd draw from these tarot cards, and they might have a few prompts on them that you'd take away to your station, and they might be drone, abundance of harmonics and overtones, or simple triadic harmony. And then you'd take those back. So all of the musicians, sometimes like 20 plus musicians at a time, playing these musical traits in an environment, a musical environment saturated in other people with more of these cards. And there was another layer, a temporal layer, a time domain layer, where these cards had psychedelic art on them. And these were the arts of Alex Gray, Pablo Amaringo, people like that. And there were projection visuals in the studio. So multi-million-dollar recording studio, and then giant projections of psychedelic art on top of the performers and over the walls. And what these would do is essentially activate people's cards, and kind of like the projectionist was a conductor in a way. And this also for me resonated with the idea that the icaros in a lot of medicine songs, they come from the visionary experience, you know. The icaros are known as woven songs, and their textiles and weavings are actually kind of like a visual score or sheet music, and can be learned from these tapestries. So yeah, everything we did, I as an artist kind of approach things as like equal weight of value to things that are intuitive or scientific, and kind of trying to blend them together. And I think you know, art and science weren't always separated, or spirituality and science weren't always separated like they are now. I guess the joining of them you would call like alchemy in some ways. And you know, you look into like the Hermetic traditions, and you find that you know, true philosophy was like, whether you're studying music or biology or the stars, you're looking at the fingerprints or the composition of the divine, you know. And that kind of like framing or of creativity and of science puts you in a different position, a different positionality, where first of all, everything you do is an act of devotion, and secondly, you're never done. You're never going to figure out the full picture. You're never clasping onto an idea for dear life, because you always know there's more to explore. And that's something I really tried to synergize and bring into music and the mystical experience. We also guided people with session reports, so deep psychedelic session reports. The vocalist would read these before singing and internalize these. And we had environmental samples, which would actually come over people's headphones during recording. So you'd be recording, and then all of a sudden ocean waves will creep in, or environmental samples would come in from a native New Zealand forest. And this, you know, resonated with how often ceremonies are held in open spaces outside in Indigenous cultures. And it was really like a harkening back to primordial community music making in a ritual context. But we had all these things that kind of steered it towards musical traits that were supportive of mystical type experiences. And we did that over 3 separate days, months between. So I could do a session, do more research, and kind of develop further, and then do another. And yeah, just keep pushing the envelope of the recording studio to its absolute limits, which was really incredible. It was really a dream of an engineer to be able to pull off something so enormous and for such an important cause. And then it took like a year of editing, because you're talking about 6 hours worth of music, no overdubs, no digital instruments, and like 30 plus microphones. So just editing for forever. And that was really, yeah, a huge challenge. And we'd set up the studio in the way that everyone had eye contact, was in the same room a lot of the time, and could see one another, but strategically place microphones and baffles so people could push the envelope and go really far beyond and not be afraid of making mistakes, because they're like, oh, Michael can sort it out if I, kind of like fumble a little bit here. So yeah, that was a quick summary of the process of music and mystical experience, which was an enormous long journey.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Michael. I'm excited. We're going to share the link so that people can check it out. It'll probably appear in the chat when we're airing this on YouTube. So definitely check it out. It's a beautiful composition, and we'll share some links so that people can learn more, links to your website and things like that. And I also just want to shout out that Michael very graciously put together a sort of toolkit for artists who are interested in creating music for these types of experiences. We're going to share that on our Health and Bass blog. So be sure to be on the lookout for that as well, because it's a great resource for anyone who's wanting to make music for these spaces. And like I said, check out Music and the Mystical Experience, just to experience it, but also for inspiration if you're looking to make music in these spaces. So thank you for that, Michael. We're kind of winding down a little bit, but I want to switch gears and talk to you for a second, Zeus, just about the future and some of the cool stuff that you're doing. You're doing some really cool stuff combining psychedelics with XR and VR, and that's opening a whole new world of possibilities, from what I've read in some of your articles and seen on some of your videos, which are very entertaining. I highly suggest you go check those out. We'll link to Zeus as well so people can see. But yeah, I saw something about, using XR and VR, giving us the ability to experience psychedelics in other realities like outer space or on another planet. What can you tell us about that? I'm excited to hear.
Yeah, so XR is extended reality, and it's really like an umbrella term to put things like VR, AR, all of these different, virtual realized reality, augmented reality, mixed reality is also within this XR framework. But also like SUBPAC is also a part of this XR experience, because I define XR, extended reality, as any wearable device that gives you sensory information. And SUBPAC definitely does that, with the thumping of the beats and everything. But of course, VR. But the thing is, XR, yeah, it sounds pretty futuristic for sure, extended reality. But really, the first like XR device was like a pair of like headphones. I mean, think about it. Like headphones, it's like virtual reality for your ears. Basically, it builds an entire auditory landscape that doesn't actually exist. It's wearable tech, and it's over 100 years old, which is fantastic. So yeah, like it feels like, yeah, we're the whole idea of XR seems futuristic, and it is pretty futuristic. It has a bright future for sure, but it also has a very extensive past, and the history of XR is a pretty dope one. But combining psychedelics is pretty well. So yeah, you have extended reality over here, and then you have these substances that are they sort of expand reality. Also, they sort of expand the boundaries of reality. So what happens if you combine those two things? Well, you get something else. it isn't completely virtual. It isn't completely pharmacological. It's something that blends two modalities together to create a third reality. And I'm writing a paper on that. That's coming out probably in like January. But my research, yeah, I'm basically giving people DMT and putting them inside VR. That's what I'm doing. And why I'm doing that? Well, I can't actually tell you why, because that's part of the whole science pursuit. I can't reveal like why I'm doing this when I'm actively doing it to people, but I can say that. What can I say? I can say that the act of what I can say is that initially I began this project in 2022. And with a sort of intention, I was looking at something. And then in the summer, this past summer, something happened with my research that essentially opened up an area of research that I didn't even believe even actually existed. I found things during this past summer that allowed me to take my research and go down a different path. And the path that I'm going down is definitely something that hasn't been explored before. And it's going to require lots of papers. And I'm actually writing my third paper right now, when the first one's still being peer-reviewed about this. But when it comes to the future of, okay, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to stop talking because I don't want to get in trouble with my like lab or the university. But I will say that the entire field of psychedelic science, and that's psychologists, therapists, everyone that's involved in a sort of scientific discipline, we are tremendously underestimating just the sheer ability to perceive when it comes to psychedelics, and how just perception itself correlates greatly with the therapeutic benefits people actually get. And it's so wild to even say that, because my research isn't even about therapeutic benefits. It's fantastic that people are researching psychedelics and they're finding that it increases it decreases depression, decreases anxiety, decreases PTSD. It's fantastic, right? That's fantastic. And I'm happy that people are researching that. But that isn't the aim of my research. My research is purely perceptual. But in this purely perceptual pursuit, I found something that I wasn't even looking for. And that is the angle that I'm going towards with this study that I just applied for ethical approval. Today's Thursday. I applied for it on Tuesday. And it's just a very long process. But I will say that a lot of people out there are underestimating just the pure shift in perception and what it can do to not only our outlook on like reality, not only our disposition towards what we can achieve, but also things like what we expect ourselves to achieve and what we expect to do and what we expect to see and what we expect to perceive. There's a thing called long-term potentiation. It's a concept, or not a concept. It's a theory that was developed by Charles Hebb from this psychologist from Canada. And I'm going to very quickly say this because I know we have to like wrap up. But he found this thing called long-term potentiation, where he saw that sort of brain cells that wire together. That's the whole sort of concept, where if you do something, then your brain adapts to whatever it is that helps you facilitate whatever you're doing quicker. Like if you ride a bike and you fall down, you ride a bike again, you ride it a little bit better, you ride it. And of course, that's called practice, that's called like learning, but it's long-term potentiation is the official sort of term. And this same guy also found that there's a thing called enriched environments. And what is that? He found that when he was doing research, he had rats. And of course, we do rats and we do things with rats and we pick their brains and all this stuff. But he found that he brought some rats home. And he just had him in his place. He made a little play set for him. He made some little balls of like yarn and, you know, whatever, a little wheel, just to like have. And then he would bring him in the lab and conduct research, and he would bring him back home, you know, just have some pets or whatever. But he found that the rats that were at his house that had the cool little things, the fun stuff, the cool, colorful things, that they would actually perform better in the same task compared to the rats that were locked in cages and very white walls in the sort of classic laboratory environments. So he's like, wow, this is interesting. So of course he did research on that, and he found that the sensory perception we cover ourselves with, that we surround ourselves with, whether it's vision or auditory, that it has a very intense influence on what we can do after experiencing this visual stimuli, or this auditory stimuli. So I'm going to wrap this up right now. Perhaps the psychedelic experience isn't necessarily dependent on the psychedelic as much as it's dependent on the sensory perception that you experience prior to taking the psychedelic.
Interesting. Fascinating. Sorry, were you going to say one more thing?
No, I literally probably said way too much. That's all I can say.
No, thank you for sharing what you could. I mean, I can't wait until the research is, you know, you could tell us more, because it's even just the fact that you said you stumbled upon something that you weren't even looking for. I'm like, ooh, what is it? Like, I want to know. So yeah. Exciting stuff. Well, thank you for sharing. And I'm sad to wind down. There's so much more I want to talk about. We may have to reconvene and do another round at some point. But before we part ways, I want to make sure that everybody feels complete. So I want to pass the mic around just one more time and see if there's anything else that you guys want to share, you want to say. And just to give you something to work off of, I guess I'll ask the question, what are you excited about in this space moving forward? And is there anything that you're cautious of as well moving forward? So yeah, I'll pass it to you, Michael.
I'm really excited about kind of what Zeus was touching on there, is that like how perception changes with psychedelics, and what kind of models that like points us to for consciousness in general. I think it's kind of been like a covert thread of mine, you know, through my research, especially when I asked the question, I was like, okay, music helps mystical type experiences in all these different ways, different brain regions, you know, synchronous neural firing, emotional modulation. But I felt this like itch being like, but why? Why does music have anything to do with mystical experiences at all? Why does it increase the probability or the power of mystical type experiences? And I dug deeper and deeper, and this is a field of research I'm creating a presentation on and trying to figure out. And I stumbled, like you, Zeus, on something I didn't expect, which was this field that you might be aware of microtubule research. And this is research into these filaments inside neurons, which are so small that they're subject to quantum phenomena. And if you apply anesthetics to a person, resonance at the microtubule level drops dramatically around 618 terahertz. And once the anesthetic goes away, resonance comes back, and boom, person's conscious again. And it's supposed that psychedelics do the inverse. They actually increase resonance at this fundamental level. And there are different mechanisms people say might be causing that, whether it's the electron clouds around the benzene rings that are around psychedelics, or whether it's a lensing effect. But the idea is anesthetics drop resonance in the microtubules, psychedelics potentially increase it. And they did this study, this person, Anyban Banyapati, where they isolated a microtubule, they used nanoprobes, and they listened to them. So they took these terahertz oscillations and brought them down to the auditory level where we can listen to them. And shockingly, they sound like singing bowls. And now, for me, the jump to be like, is this musical phenomena at the small fundamental part of our brain that's so small that it's like literally on the edge of where Newtonian physics meets the quantum, right? And the reason I would advocate that it's musical phenomena is because this pattern resonates self-similarly all the way up into the EEG range. And it does so with octaves and with triplets. Now, triplets are the standing wave function of the fifth. And the octave in the fifth, using that, you get the entire musical system that we use, all 12 keys, all the chords, every scale generates from this thing. So like at the foundation, like our cognitive processes, our physical cognitive processes at least, there's this musical like phenomena. And something I wanted to ask you, Zeus, was when I played this music, this microtubule resonance to a friend who works a lot in the Amazon with indigenous peoples, they said, that's the sound I hear when I'm on ayahuasca. And then I also, when I was reading Rick Strassman's book, all the people being intravenously given DMT, there's page after page after page after page in this book, there's dozens of them, of people being like, it always starts with this metallic resonance that's and then pops them out into another dimension. And I was wondering whether this resonance, this common hallucination that people experience, whether it might not be a hallucination after all, whether it might be this resonance which resonates self-similarly from the microtubules to the neurons to the EEG range, whether it might be this resonance increasing and then getting into the auditory range because it's replicated throughout the neurons, and whether this might be a window into understanding kind of like a vibratory or musical model for consciousness. And especially when you look into the way the entire connectome works with under psychedelic therapy, there's the study by Salim Atasoy who uses basically the formula that cymatic patterns have, and looking at cymatic patterns in the brain. And again, she finds that psychedelics move entropy or energy from low frequency harmonics or information to high frequency harmonics and information. And we see the same in the EEG range, like low EEG levels are associated with unconsciousness or low consciousness, and high as more alert or transcendent states of consciousness. And you see this in all these different fields of neuroscience. So I wanted to ask you, Zeus, whether you think there might be a place for a vibratory model for consciousness in the future.
So yeah, Great question. And yeah, the microtubule stuff. Oh my gosh, that's like OR theory. I love talking about OR theory, but it's unfalsified. It's so I want it to be true. I want it to be true, but it's to be difficult to prove. But yes. So I like the idea of what you said. I'm gonna take it a little bit, not further, but in a different sort of direction. In 2020, this fantastic scientist, Thomas Varley, wrote this paper at Indiana University, I believe, and he discovered, I think it's one of the greatest research papers ever about psychedelics. He found that psychedelics actually increases the fractal dimension in our brains. The way psychedelics implements its effect, he discovered through fMRI data, lots of complex mathematical equations, lots of stuff. He discovered that psychedelics increases the fractal dimension in our brain. And what does that even mean? That sounds pretty like crazy, but he found that the way brain activity increases and sort of gets to be chaotic, we sort of perceived it as like chaotic. It's just, the DMN, the CN, just all this stuff just going crazy, and the sort of systems and areas are, losing integration and all of this stuff is happening. Functional activities are going wild, global connectivity. But he discovered that actually it's happening in a very fractal way. It isn't so chaotic. It's very fractal. And that paper was amazing. And then last year, Parker Singleton, this fantastic scientist from South Carolina, I believe, he discovered that, yes, that happens. But what also happens is when a person takes psychedelics, that the brain energy, so it basically costs energy for our brain to do anything, basically. That's just like the toll to be alive. It costs energy for our brain to go from area to area. But he discovered that psychedelics actually decreases the cost of brain energy to go from area to area. It decreases the cost. So what happens is, since there's a decrease in the cost of energy to go from brain area to brain area, our brains during this very psychedelic experience goes from brain area to brain area quicker because it costs less. So it increases this fractal activity. So you're saying that it's sort of an acoustic based thing. And so I do want to say this. Perhaps. And I think that perhaps how we look at the brain, how we sort of look at voxels in the brain through fMRI, I think that there's a chance, Michael, that perhaps like my entire field is doing it all wrong. And the reason why is because there's a paper that came out over the summer that actually said, look, guys, and this changed the game. It's one of the greatest papers I've ever read. It said, guys, we're putting people's brain in fMRI machines, EEG, fNIRS, but we aren't accounting for the geometry of the brain. We aren't accounting for the curves of the brain, how the brain curves. So perhaps this energy distribution that we just see as like voxels and activity, perhaps what we see as activity and decreases in activity is just based on the actual contour structures of our actual brain. So in the sense that perhaps the sort of and perhaps this contour can sort of attribute to the acoustic function or the acoustic design of energy distribution as well. It's something that we don't have enough information to sort of assess, but it's interesting to really look at.
Fascinating. Thank you for bringing that up, Michael, and thank you, Zeus, for giving us your perspective, because that's fascinating. There's so much more, like we said, there's so much more to get into. We definitely have to talk, when we get off, we'll talk about reconvening for another round of this.
Very cool.
Yeah, for sure. But Zeus, before, I want to give you an opportunity to just any final things you want to share, maybe something you're excited about or something you're cautious about, or both, that you want to leave us with.
Yes, I want to very quickly, I know we have to wrap up. I want to say big thanks to HGC and SUBPAC for being an actual company that builds devices in which we could implement to discover perceptual alterations within an actual trip. We're also using SUBPAC in our research, and we're finding some really cool things. And also to just I don't know, I do want to say this very, very quickly. I know we don't have enough time. I want to say this very quickly. So Michael, you quickly said, or you mentioned that people that do DMT intravenously, they have a very similar experience. And this is based on Rick's research at the University of New Mexico, where he just shot people with DMT, which is fantastic. And then people say, oh, well, that should serve as evidence that we're going to a certain place, or there's something that's an extra dimensional place that we're going to, that's a shared experience. Okay, that's interesting. That's fun, you know? Or could it be that despite our vast differences in culture and ethnic differences and cultural differences and gender differences and sexual differences, that despite all of this, that we all fundamentally have the same thing in our head, the same sort of hardware in our head. And when we take a substance that's the same, DMT, that we have a similar experience. How when we taste cake, it's sweet if you're from Iceland or India or Indiana. It shows that we're all relatively the same, and that when we have a perceptual experience with psychedelics, that we experience the same thing, because we're all like the same humans, basically.
Yeah, I think there's evidence for that when you look at, say, lower threshold psychedelic doses, say like one tab of LSD, and a lot of the personal psyche, the personal really individual stuff will come up, and these will be individual memories and associations. If you go a bit deeper, you enter what Stan Grof would call the perinatal kind of rebirth experience, and you'll potentially relive your own birth. But when you push the envelope even further with a bigger dose of LSD or repeated dose or DMT, you're pushing that envelope so far, and people enter, having very similar experiences. And it's like the deeper you go, the more similar people get, is what I'm hearing. And that these chemicals are catalysts for deeper and deeper exploration into, some people want to say realities, some people want to say collective superconscious or subconscious. Maybe it's both. Who really knows? I think we're very materialistic in our worldview, but if we look back at 99.9% of our ancestors, they had a more animistic kind of view of the world, and even our language, when we say, oh, that doesn't matter, the importance, that doesn't matter, that isn't material. But so much of our experience is the blend of these two things. And I think for anyone to say that, like, we're going into DMT hyperspace and it's a real place and there's real information and things there, maybe, but also for someone to say it's all in your head, it's like maybe as well, and it's like, yeah, I'm excited for that question to keep and those two sides of science and spirituality to keep butting heads, because I think ultimately it will just hopefully strengthen both of them, and science will get a bit more flexible and spirituality will get a bit more structured and it will gather more knowledge. That's my hope for the future, at least.
I love that. No, what a great note to end on. I love how both of you said, it's like the deeper you go, the more we're the same. I feel like that's and just even being able to utilize these substances as something that can help us to remember that fact. There's so much in the world right now that's trying to keep us divided and separated and labeling one another as different things, but it's really special and profound that these substances can bring us back to what's important, which is our humanity, and we're all the same. Also love what you said about the blending of science and spirit. I feel like it's a return to that coexistence. I think you said it earlier in the conversation, Michael, that they didn't used to be so divided, and now it's like they're kind of coexisting in a better way. So great conversation. Thank you both for all of your contributions. There's so much. I know the audience is gonna love this and leave the conversation feeling so informed and with more questions, more things to learn about. So I'm really grateful. I want to thank both of you guys for being here and for sharing all that you did. Also just want to give a special thank you to our audience, anyone who's watching. Thank you for tuning in, as well as to our partners and our supporters. Thank you. If you want to learn more about Project Immersed, you can check us out on our website, projectimmersed.org. We'll share some links so that you guys can learn more about Zeus and Michael and find them. Get in touch if you feel called to do so. And yeah, that's it. Blessings and thank you, everybody.
You've been watching Project Immersed. Thanks for tuning in.